How do you think about this where, multiple vendors are trying to go after a particular bucket or area of spend and they have these different claims? And how do you attribute, what is happening to each individual vendor to validate whether or not their ROI or claims or their cost savings methodology really is going to move the needle and tackle that specific area of spend that they're talking about?
Yeah, it's not easy.
Mhm.
I'll start there. Typically involves a lot of really detailed analysis, and that can be really difficult for, actuaries and analytical professionals to do just because sometimes claims information is limited. So just to be totally transparent, it's not incredibly often that we can actually isolate the impact of each vendor, but having a good understanding of how each vendor is impacting claims allows us to get an idea of what's going on, so that we can understand, okay, this is exactly what this vendor's doing. This vendor's doing, something similar but different, and how they're and understanding how each is impacting claims and how each is shifting utilization. That's how we can start to get a better feeling for this. But I will say I have heard, CFOs um, concerned about exactly what you said, because there are so many solutions targeting, similar areas. They're worried about that overlap. So that's an increasing concern that I've seen from CFOs. And I know actuarial teams are trying their best to isolate those. And so the best thing that we can do is work really closely with the vendors, just to have a really good understanding of how the program works, so that we can do our best to address those concerns.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you're talking a lot about utilization, which, is largely, execution oriented, right? So, if you can have the best plans possible, but if you can't execute and actually get people to utilize the product, then, it's not going to work, right? So as you were thinking, utilization being such a key driver of delivering these financial results, what do you guys look at from an actuarial perspective in terms of ability to drive utilization? Because a lot of that is actually the execution of the program that might be other stakeholders, perhaps at the buyer, who are very engaged in making that happen.
Yeah, that's always, I think, one of the trickier assumptions to try and validate.
Hmm.
And so we're doing a lot of work just looking at other programs that may be similar. We're seeing what kind of engagement rates we see there. And
Hmm.
so we're trying to use that to best inform what we think utilization and engagement in a given service will be. So you're right; it is very dependent on how it's being implemented
Hmm.
and the operational, aspects behind it. And so what we're doing is we're trying to do our best to look at anything else that's been done and get a clear understanding of how it's going to be rolled out, right?
Hmm.
I've evaluated vendors where I've asked, the operations team, how is this going to be rolled out? And if it's very minimal marketing, then I'm going to have to put in a very minimal engagement assumption, just
Hmm.
because people aren't going to know about it. And so working together with other partners is really helpful, just in understanding what we might expect. And that's, I would say, just for vendors, that's going to be one of the most, I think, pressure tested assumptions that you have, because every vendor has an assumption of engagement.
Welcome to Spark Spotlight. I'm your host, Lindsay Kratzer, CEO of Spark Health Advisors, where we help healthcare companies successfully navigate and accelerate in the employer and payer markets. On this podcast, we talk specifically about what it takes to sell into employers and health plans. I sit down with founders, executives, and industry leaders to unpack what's working, what's not, and how to win in these complex sales environments. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Spark Spotlight. Today, I have Mandy Geyer with us. I'm really excited about this topic because what we're going to talk about today is Mandy's perspective on the financial value story for both employers and payers. She is an actuary and has sat behind the table listening to tons of different vendor pitches and evaluating solutions from an actuarial perspective for both the payer and the employer side of things for throughout numerous roles that she's had. I think it's going to be really exciting to kind of hear her perspective on what really makes the financial value story stand out for vendors that are out there. I think this is really timely because obviously costs are out of control. And so many companies are saying, hey, we're going to target like this 10% of your spend, or we're going to bring your spend down in this area. Do those claims actually hold water? What do you need to communicate to actually get the buy-in from the more sophisticated financial buyers? So I'm really excited to dig into that topic today. So welcome, Mandy.
Thanks, Lindsay. I'm excited to be here and talk about this.
Awesome. Do you mind, Mandy, starting off by sharing a little bit about your background? Because I think you have a really fantastic and impressive background where you've seen things from multiple vantage points, which should be really interesting for our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll try and keep it somewhat brief. But as you mentioned, I am an actuary. And so I spent the bulk of my career in benefits consulting. I was working with employers of all sizes with all of their actuarial needs and helping them evaluate vendors and see which vendors had value and how they could help reduce the plan's trend and help reduce costs. I also spent time on the employer side, sat on the at the employer table evaluating some of these vendors, and then also spent time on the payer side. So I was actually led the cost of care team at a major payer and was on the committee where we were evaluating vendors to work with. I've kind of seen all sides of it, and so I love to talk about this. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, especially right now because, as you mentioned, costs are high, and I think actuaries and finance leaders are increasingly becoming kind of gatekeepers when hiring new vendors because they really need to see cost reductions. Everybody wants their benefits trend to come down, so I just think it's a really important topic right now, and understanding what those actuaries and finance leaders are looking for when you're presenting a solution.
Yeah, absolutely. We are absolutely seeing, CFO involvement, increasing as well. So super helpful background. You said you've looked at it from the consultant background, the employer background, and the payer background. So obviously very different vantage points about what they care about, in terms of financial value and how they're evaluating those solutions. Do you maybe mind just starting off by setting the stage at a high level for what these different buyer types care about when they're evaluating new solutions from a financial value perspective? And we can go from there.
Yeah, that sounds great. So, yeah, it would seem at first glance that they're all kind of looking at the same thing, right? Financial value, but they do tend to look for different things. So, thinking about the payer side first, payers tend to be, I would say, the most rigorous of the three.
Mhm.
A lot of times they'll have target ROI thresholds when working with vendors. So, it's really helpful to understand that up front. And they're also going to have actuarial and analytical teams that will evaluate the solution on their own. So, also something to keep in mind that they will have their own team looking at this. So, that's where you need to make sure that you have really clear assumptions and clear methodology so that their teams, when they pressure test these results, both upfront and after implementation, if implemented, they know exactly how to measure your the solution that you're bringing to the table. I would say employers also care about ROI too, but it's usually a little bit more practical and business driven. They're typically trying to decide, does this fit into our budget? How does this integrate with everything else that we're offering? And ultimately, is the juice worth the squeeze? I've seen vendors present to employers with these huge savings in ROI estimates, but it's really disruptive to their member population. And so they may decide, you know what, that is a great value story, but I don't know if we're ready for that employee disruption and HR burden yet. And then finally, kind of thinking about consultants and brokers, I think they're really looking for credibility and comparability. So they are looking at a bunch of different solutions. So typically, if you're presenting your solution to a consultant or broker, they're looking at all of your competitors as well. So they really want to understand, how do your savings compare to your competitors and how is what you're doing different? They also want to make sure that they can stress test the assumptions on behalf of their clients so that they feel comfortable with the savings that are being presented to employers. Really, everybody kind of cares about ROI and financial value. It's just a little bit different in how they're thinking about it and validating.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's fantastic. What about timelines? Because we hear a lot about employers, especially looking for a really short term, near term ROI, where they're looking for solutions that are going to move the needle very quickly because these people are not always employed at the organization for a long time. Obviously, that differs based on employer. I would think that payers would take a little bit more of a longer term perspective in terms of the ROI, but are probably also looking for more immediate results. So, can you tell us a little bit about maybe how timelines differ for the different buyer types?
Yeah, and I think everybody wants savings right away,
Mhm.
especially right now, unfortunately, because some of these solutions need a little bit of time to get to the true ROI. I think sometimes you'll see payers and employers willing to be a little more patient, but they both have turnover, right? As you mentioned, employers have turnover within their population. Payers also have turnover within their member population. And from my experience right now, especially with claims trend as high as it is, everybody's looking for a first year ROI. Everybody
Mhm.
wants a positive ROI year one. And so it's great if you can propose, longer term ROI, but they really want to see that 1 year ROI upfront.
Yeah. And I think that's different than it has been historically. I mean, at least like
Yeah.
from being in industry for years, we used to project out, here's your 3-year ROI or your 5-year ROI, and it's going to take an investment up front, but we're going to kind of make this back for you. And I think that now, like that, there's not much appetite for that, is what we're finding.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What about the stakeholders involved at the different buyer types as well? Can you talk a little bit about that? I think I mentioned earlier that we're seeing, increasing CFO involvement or, financial representation from an employer's perspective. You mentioned obviously kind of sitting on that cost of care as an actuary team at the payer perspective. So it would be helpful to kind of understand who, from a financial perspective, is typically the decision maker or an influencer, kind of based on the different buyer types we talked about.
Yeah, yeah. So when I think about payers, there's typically someone from finance being represented in that decision-making process. And that can be anybody from, an actuarial VP to the chief actuary to the CFO. So there's some level of finance and actuarial involvement in addition to, I think, the rest of the stakeholders. They want to make sure network is represented and clinical, but finance is having an increasingly, as I mentioned before, an increasingly important seat at the table because those assumptions are so important. And we think about the employer side, like you mentioned, CFOs are increasingly getting involved. I think they're relying a lot on their consultant and broker partners. So the actuaries working with them at their consultant and broker partners to validate any of the savings and kind of stress test those assumptions and make sure that those savings are real. So yeah, we're increasingly seeing, like I said, up to the CFO level, kind of across the board for payers and employers when it comes to this financial decision making process. And they're really relying on the actuaries on their team, whether it be at the consultant or broker or within their organization at a payer.
What about, so a lot of companies obviously go out there and they have some sort of third party validation of their cost savings methodology, and they use that obviously to try to, expedite this process. How do you, from kind of an actuary perspective, typically think about those third party validations? And is that something that does help speed up the process, or is that something that it is not necessarily worth the time?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's helpful in that at the very least it signals that the vendor is willing to share their information with a third party to get that validation. So they're willing to have that kind of third party come in and take a look under the hood, so to speak. But as actuaries, we only trust our own work at the end of the day, unfortunately. We're a little self-centered like that, if you want to say that, but we really trust ourselves. And so every payer that I've worked with, every broker consultant, they typically want to have their own actuaries and finance people take a look and stress test those assumptions. And it does help to have that kind of first pass from a third party, but like they're still going to come in as actuaries, we're still going to come in and we're going to want to understand it ourselves and make sure that we're comfortable with all of those assumptions and methodology.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Trust but verify, right? So that makes sense. So, obviously, a lot of companies are talking about their clinical outcomes, and that's part of the financial value story. How do you kind of think about clinical outcomes and then how that translates into financial impact? And then maybe where do companies kind of get cross with you guys from a financial perspective on what they're projecting, perhaps, versus like what you are seeing and what you are projecting based on your work?
Yeah, I think the biggest kind of thing we run into with clinical outcomes is making sure that those clinical outcomes are tied to utilization. We'll see a lot of vendors come in and say, hey, we reduce HbA1c levels or we reduce diabetic, hospitalizations, but it's really hard to understand. You really need to tie that to actual shifts in utilization and make sure that it's not showing up somewhere else. So that's kind of the other thing I tend to see when it comes to clinical outcomes is, okay, that's great that we have this clinical outcome, but how is that actually changing utilization so that we can see the cost impact? And is that cost going to show up somewhere else? So just because it went down in one area, is it going to go up in another? So that tends to be the biggest disconnect because vendors are really great about demonstrating the clinical outcomes because they are, easier to measure and easier to get to, especially new vendors. And I totally get it, but we want to see how does that actually change the utilization so that we can see how the cost is actually impacted.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think as you're thinking about kind of the clinical outcomes as well, I think that a lot of organizations are also kind of going after the same bucket of spend oftentimes. And they're saying, we're going to move the needle in this area. To your point, it may actually impact costs in a different area. But how do you think about this where, multiple vendors are trying to go after a particular bucket or area of spend and they have these different claims, and how do you kind of attribute what is happening to each individual vendor to validate whether or not their ROI or claims or their cost savings methodology really is going to move the needle and tackle that specific area of spend that they're talking about?
Yeah, it's not easy.
Mhm.
I'll start there. So it typically involves a lot of really detailed analysis, and that can be really difficult for actuaries and analytical professionals to do just because sometimes claims information is limited. So just to be totally transparent, it's not incredibly often that we can actually isolate the impact of each vendor. But having a good understanding of how each vendor is impacting claims allows us to get an idea of what's going on, so that we can understand, okay, this is exactly what this vendor's doing. This vendor's doing something similar but different, and how they're in understanding how each is impacting claims and how each is shifting utilization. That's how we can start to get a better feeling for this. But I will say I have heard CFOs concerned about exactly what you said, because there are so many solutions targeting similar areas. They're worried about that overlap. So that's an increasing concern that I've seen from CFOs. And I know actuarial teams are trying their best to isolate those. And so the best thing that we can do is work really closely with the vendors, just to have a
Mhm.
really good understanding of how the program works so that we can do our best to address those concerns.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And you're talking obviously a lot about utilization, which, is largely, execution oriented, right? So, if you can have the best plans possible, but if you can't execute and actually get people to utilize the product, then, it's not going to work, right? So, as you were thinking about utilization being such a key driver of delivering these financial results, what do you guys look at from an actuarial perspective in terms of ability to drive utilization? Because again, a lot of that is actually the execution of the program that might be other stakeholders perhaps at the buyer, who are very engaged in making that happen.
Yeah, and that's always, I think, one of the trickier assumptions to try and validate.
Hmm.
And so we're doing a lot of work just looking at other programs that may be similar. We're seeing what kind of engagement rates we see there. And
Hmm.
so we're trying to use that to best inform what we think utilization and engagement in a given service will be. So you're right, it is very dependent on how it's being implemented
Hmm.
and the operational aspects behind it. And so what we're doing is we're trying to do our best to look at anything else that's been done and get a clear understanding of how it's going to be rolled out, right? I've evaluated vendors where I've asked, the operations team, how is this going to be rolled out? And if it's very minimal marketing, then I'm going to have to put in a very minimal engagement assumption just
Hmm.
because people aren't going to know about it. And so working together with other partners is really helpful just in understanding what we might expect. And that's, I would say, just for vendors, that's going to be one of the most, I think, pressure tested assumptions that you have, because every vendor has an assumption of engagement. And so we're going to ask a lot of questions about what they see with other clients, what they see with similar populations, just to really feel comfortable with that assumption, because it drives so much of the financial results.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, as we are working with some of the earlier stage companies that are newer in some of these markets, I find that that is often an area that is not really thought out as much on the front end. And, as they're starting to build their client base, that's something that's obviously super important to actually delivering on the program. And so we tend to coach companies to think about, what is going to be that engagement experience, how you're going to drive utilization early. And then that needs to be included in your sales process as well, because to your point, it's, a key aspect of that buying decision that maybe happens in implementation and once the service is live, but it's something that needs to be thought of on the front end in a more strategic way than just, we're going to market to your members, right? So
Yeah, yeah, exactly. When you come in and say, "Hey, we're going to engage 25% of the target population," I'm going to say, well, "How do you know that?
yes.
How do you how are you going to do that?"
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's an opportunity as well to really work on kind of integration with other vendors that are, part of the buyer's ecosystem. We always work with clients on that as well. So I think that would be a positive aspect of kind of this aggregation trend that we're seeing more broadly, because I think that it is very difficult for each individual point solution to reach that member on their own versus kind of being really part of a broader ecosystem, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So, question two. So, from like a pricing perspective, curious what types of pricing strategies you may be seeing that are trending or getting more, just making progress in this market. I think that historically, a lot of companies were a PEPM. And I think that the appetite for buying those types of solutions is not necessarily there now, right? I think that a lot of organizations have moved to kind of like buy the drink type of pricing, but we've seen an increasing number of companies looking to put a lot of their fees at risk or kind of have more of a cost sharing type of pricing methodology. So just curious from your perspective of looking at lots of different types of solutions, what are you seeing trending the most in terms of solutions that are appealing to the buyer from a pricing perspective?
Yeah, I think I've seen a bigger shift towards like outcomes based pricing.
Mhm.
So employers and payers really want to see, okay, if you actually achieve the outcomes that you've promised, then we can agree on a fee and on a payment. And so I've seen that shift happening, which I think is really positive for everybody. Where it gets a little bit tricky is when that becomes a shared savings arrangement. So
Mhm.
I've seen it work much better where you have a flat fee based on outcomes, just because that's much more predictable pricing. It's a lot easier to put into, a financial plan. It's easier for the consultants and brokers to understand and to put into pricing and budgeting for an employer, easier for payers. When you get to that shared savings arrangement where you're sharing a percentage, especially when you're talking about cost avoidance or claims that maybe didn't happen, that's a little bit harder to prove. That's where I think conversations get a lot tougher, because even though it makes logical sense, it's just a lot harder to budget for. It's a lot harder to understand, and it's a lot harder to necessarily prove those real savings, right? Maybe they would have happened anyway. So the outcomes based fixed fee is where I'm seeing a lot of people start to move. And that's where I think a lot of employers and payers want to see the market to move. Okay, prove that you've done this, and then we'll agree on a payment. And like you said, putting fees at risk, I think is also, that's a huge shift right now. And I think a lot more people, to your point, are willing to put much bigger fees at risk. And I think that makes it a lot easier for employers to payers to take a chance on a new vendor and see how they may be able to help their membership.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for that. So you may be thinking about kind of the operational risk for large employers or payers that are looking to implement a solution. I think you mentioned earlier that a solution may be really interesting and could drive a lot of financial value, but if it's going to disrupt the members, especially when you're thinking about the employer, then it may be a no go. What about from the payer's perspective? Because I think that there are so many interesting innovations that are out there, but there is a huge lift to actually implement them at payer or even an employer. And so I think that there is a balance that most of these organizations are looking at. Can you speak at all to kind of what you've seen in terms of like that balance between the operational lift and then the financial value that could be created?
Yeah, yeah, and I will say throughout history, since I've been working with employers and payers, that's kind of shifted back and forth. So I feel like when claims are running well, they're much more willing to they're much less willing to disrupt members, right? They're more willing to kind of go with the status quo. I think right now, with budgets as tight as they are, there is a little more appetite to disrupt members than there has been in the past.
Mhm.
So I think for those solutions that are offering big ROI but might be disruptive, I think now is a much better time than it may have been, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, where employers or payers are much more willing to disrupt members. Now, it is just a fine balance though, right? And it's understanding the other solutions that an employer or payer has implemented and has for their membership, and how disruptive this new benefit may be. So it's, like I said, fine balance. I think right now though the shift is towards higher financial value. They're willing to take a little more disruption for
Yeah.
members.
I've been speaking to more solutions lately too that have a message around delivering financial value, but not disrupting, your benefit plan design or disrupting the members. And I think when there is a benefit for all parties involved, obviously that's like a win for everyone. But that's like the holy grail. How do you achieve that? So
That's what everybody
um,
wants.
yeah. Not everybody can do that. But one kind of question as we're thinking about wrapping up, for those vendors that are out there that are successful in communicating their financial value and making progress in both the employer and payer world, what do you think distinguishes those than the companies that are not successful in communicating their financial value? Like, are there any things that we haven't touched on that, you think that organizations or vendors should be aware of as they're thinking about how to, best articulate the financial value and demonstrate that so that they can bypass those gatekeepers or work through those gatekeepers, like you were talking about, that are from the finance side of the world as they have an increasingly larger role at the table.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just to be transparent and collaborative. So be willing to be as transparent as you can with your assumptions and methodology and how your solution is generating savings, and just be willing to collaborate because you're going to have to at some point with the actuarial or finance team. And so just be open and willing to collaborate with the team. So that you can both work together because at the end of the day, you're both on the same side. I know sometimes, vendors can see the actuarial and finance team not necessarily as the but as somebody they have to try and convince. And so if you view yourselves as on the same team, I think the actuarial and finance teams will do the same, and you can come together and figure it out together because you both want to help the customer at the end of the day. So I would just say be willing to be collaborative and transparent.
Yeah, and just a call out for you, Mandy, I think that that's obviously a big area where you can help companies. So for our audience, we are increasingly working with Mandy, given her fantastic expertise to help our clients, but she is consulting with different vendors to help with really framing up this story so that they can, make progress in all of these areas. So I think that really having someone that speaks that language on your team and helping to build out your financial model or validate it and then support in kind of those that process can be really key to seeing success in this area.
Yeah, yeah, and I love doing it, and I love being able to lend my expertise. So I'm really excited to be working more with Spark.
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. Well, Mandy, anything that we didn't touch on in closing that you'd like to call out?
I don't think so. I feel like we covered the big topics, and yeah, like I said, just be ready to be transparent. That's the
Yes.
best advice I can give.
I love that. Transparent and collaborative. I think that should be goals for
Yes,
everyone, right? So,
yes.
well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining today. Really appreciate it. Super interesting conversation. I think we could talk about this probably forever. I always have a million questions here. So, very much appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective and lending your insight.
Great. Thanks for having me.